They were draped in silk, crowned with jewels and surrounded by gold, yet behind the sparkle lay a life most of us would never choose. These royal women smiled through the stench, stood tall in lice-filled wigs, and brought heirs into the world under the eyes of strangers. They traded comfort, health, and dignity for an image they could never let slip. Their beauty was their armor, but it came at a cost only they truly knew. This is not just the story of bad hygiene. It's the story of women who suffered in silence to uphold the illusion of perfection. Royal life in the 17th century is often imagined as a picture of grace and refinement. People think of grand gowns stitched with gold thread, jewels sparkling in candlelight, and the gentle scent of fine perfume drifting through marble corridors. For noble women, the image was even more delicate and polished. They were symbols of beauty, style, and sophistication, admired not only for their appearance but also for the status they represented. From portraits and court records, it is easy to believe that their lives were spotless, literally and figuratively. The idea of a royal woman conjures visions of luxury from head to toe, a standard far above that of the common people. But behind the embroidery and elegance, the truth was less charming. Hygiene standards among the upper classes were surprisingly poor, and in many cases, worse than those of ordinary townsfolk. The lavish appearance was a carefully maintained surface, hiding habits and conditions that would shock modern sensibilities. Perfume often replaced cleaning, and fine fabrics could not cover the fact that bodies and surroundings were far from fresh. The grand halls of Versailles may have glittered, but they also carried scents that had nothing to do with roses or lavender. If you think Versailles smelled like roses, wait until you discover what floated in the hallways. The contrast between what was seen and what was real is at the heart of this story. These women were the faces of a glamorous world, yet daily life for them involved discomfort, unpleasant odors, and practices that modern readers might find unbelievable. Their beauty was often achieved at a personal cost, both to comfort and to health. The illusion of royal cleanliness begins to fade when we look closely at the daily routines of the time. And it all begins with the most basic human need, washing. In the 17th century, the idea of bathing regularly was far from common among the European elite. At the time, many physicians believed that warm water was dangerous because it opened the pores, allowing disease to slip into the body. This belief, rooted in early medical theories, meant that water was treated not as a source of health but as a potential hazard. Adding to this fear, the Church often discouraged bathing, associating it with vanity, indulgence, or even moral weakness. Public bathhouses, once more common in earlier centuries, had fallen out of favor, partly because they were linked to immorality. For noble women, who were expected to protect their reputations, avoiding baths became both a social and a supposed medical safeguard. As a result, most women of high status might go months without fully immersing themselves in water. Instead of bathing, they relied on partial cleaning methods, which were seen as safer. A common approach was to use a damp cloth to wipe the face, hands, and sometimes the neck. These cloths were often moistened not with plain water, but with vinegar or alcohol, which were thought to disinfect without opening the pores too much. In some cases, saliva was even used for spot cleaning small areas of the skin. Clothing was layered and perfumes were applied to mask any lingering odors, creating an appearance of freshness that was more illusion than reality. The idea of bathing as a luxury or necessity simply did not fit with the values of the time. In fact, for a noble woman to seek frequent baths might raise eyebrows, as it could be seen as excessive attention to the body, bordering on sinful self-indulgence. Cleanliness was defined more by visible presentation, smooth skin, powdered hair, and fine fabrics, than by actual hygiene. This avoidance of water created its own set of problems, which became all too obvious in the confined spaces of a busy royal court. Without bathing, natural oils, sweat, and other residues built up on the skin, and heavy fabrics trapped heat and odor. But the question remains: if they weren't bathing, how did they deal with other basic bodily needs? The answer leads us into an even less pleasant part of court life, where the real sanitation problem begins to appear. Toilets, as we know them today, were almost entirely absent from the royal palaces of the 17th century. Even in Versailles, one of the grandest residences in Europe, proper sanitation facilities were scarce. Instead, members of the court relied on chamber pots, portable containers kept under beds, behind curtains, or tucked discreetly into corners. When nature called, these pots were used and then emptied by servants, sometimes into cesspits but often directly out of windows. The result was that palace courtyards and surrounding grounds could quickly become foul-smelling and hazardous. The lack of facilities meant that some courtiers, especially men, did not even bother with chamber pots. It was not unusual for men to relieve themselves off balconies or in palace gardens. Worse still, certain corridors inside Versailles were used as informal urinals. The problem became so widespread that in 1715, a royal order was issued requiring the palace corridors to be cleaned once a week. By modern standards, this was hardly enough, but at the time it was considered an improvement. For noble women, this unsanitary environment presented practical challenges. Their gowns were long, heavy, and layered, sweeping the floors as they walked. Navigating a corridor meant not only keeping one's balance on polished stone but also avoiding the unpleasant patches that might be underfoot. A misstep could soil expensive fabrics, and the weight of a damp, contaminated hem was both uncomfortable and unhygienic. It was one thing to encounter waste underfoot, but the real danger came when sanitation problems crossed into other parts of palace life. Waste and foul odors did not stay confined to the corridors or gardens. They could, and sometimes did, find their way into unexpected and deeply unsettling places. And that wasn't even the worst thing they had to step over, because the contamination sometimes reached the very kitchens that prepared the royal meals. The kitchens of Versailles, despite serving one of the most powerful courts in Europe, were far from clean by modern standards. Poorly designed plumbing systems often caused wastewater to backflow into food preparation areas, especially during heavy rains or when the cesspits overflowed. This meant that the very spaces where elaborate meals were prepared could be contaminated with sewage. The sheer volume of food needed to feed the royal household and its endless guests only made matters worse, overwhelming the limited facilities. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, particularly in the summer months. Fish and poultry might sit for hours or even days before being cooked, and any leftovers were often reused in other dishes. Fruits and vegetables, stored in less than ideal conditions, attracted pests. Rats and insects were common sights in the storage rooms, leaving behind droppings or burrowing into sacks of flour. The cooks did their best within the limitations of the time, but hygiene was not yet understood as a vital part of food safety. The consequences were predictable and frequent. Foodborne illnesses like diarrhea, vomiting, and severe stomach cramps were common among courtiers. Intestinal worms, including tapeworms, were also a persistent problem, spread through undercooked meat or contaminated ingredients. It is said that even members of the royal family were not spared these uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous ailments. Yet the problem of parasites extended beyond the dinner table. Contamination did not only invade the stomach, it could make its home in other parts of the body. And in a court obsessed with appearance, there was one place in particular where pests thrived unnoticed, hidden beneath elaborate displays of style. But parasites weren't just in their stomachs. Some lived much closer to the crown, buried in the most fashionable part of a royal woman's appearance. Hairstyles at the royal court were not simply about looking attractive. They were feats of construction. Noble women often wore elaborate wigs or styled their natural hair into towering shapes using wire frames, padding and curls. To hold everything in place, pomade made from animal fat, often beef or mutton tallow, was applied generously. This sticky, oily substance gave the desired texture and shine, but it also provided the perfect environment for lice. Without frequent washing, these elaborate creations became warm, sheltered habitats for entire colonies of insects. Lice infestations were so common that special tools called lice claws were used to scratch the scalp without disturbing the hairstyle. These were long, thin implements, sometimes made of silver, that could be slipped discreetly under the layers of hair. Women might carry them to social events or even to meals, pausing to relieve an itch while continuing polite conversation. The act was so normalized that it rarely raised comment, even at the most formal gatherings. The wigs themselves were far from comfortable. Their weight could cause headaches and neck pain, especially during long days at court. The height and width of certain styles made simple tasks, such as sitting in a carriage, awkward. There were even cases of wigs catching fire when a woman passed too close to a candlelit chandelier. Despite the risks and discomfort, abandoning fashionable hair was not an option. In a society where appearance was closely tied to status, a poorly maintained style could damage one's reputation. While a woman could discreetly scratch her scalp or adjust her hair, there was one experience that offered no such privacy or control. It was an event that every royal woman was expected to endure, one that turned the most personal of moments into a public spectacle. But while they could scratch their scalps, there was one thing no woman could escape: the royal childbirth spectacle, where the entire court might witness the arrival of an heir. For royal women, childbirth was not a private, intimate moment shared with family. It was a public duty, and the delivery itself often became a spectacle. The reason was rooted in politics and suspicion. There was always the fear that a stillborn or female infant could be secretly replaced with a healthy male heir. To prevent any possibility of deception, royal births were attended by a large audience of courtiers, doctors, and high-ranking officials. In some cases, the room was so crowded that it resembled a public hall more than a place of medical care. These gatherings were far from comfortable. The rooms were overheated by the crush of bodies and the heavy curtains drawn for privacy from the outside, even as the mother had no privacy inside. Women in labor endured not only the physical pain but also the strain of being observed during one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. The emotional toll was considerable, especially since every gesture, sound, and expression could be witnessed and whispered about later at court. Medical care at the time offered little reassurance. Childbirth carried significant risks for both mother and baby. Without an understanding of germs, attendants and physicians worked with unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments. This led to a high rate of infection, a major cause of maternal death. Infant mortality was also alarmingly high, with many children dying within their first years of life. For royal women, the pressure to produce a healthy heir meant that even repeated losses had to be endured under public scrutiny. The very people who delivered these babies were often the same ones who moved freely through the court, touching fabrics, furniture, and even food without any awareness of the danger they carried. And the same unwashed hands that delivered babies also touched the wounds of the sick, the clothes of the court, and the tools of physicians, spreading infection through more than just the royal nursery. In the 17th century, the concept of germs as invisible carriers of disease was completely unknown. Illness was often blamed on bad air, imbalances of bodily fluids, or even moral weakness, but never on microscopic organisms. As a result, doctors and midwives moved from one patient to another without washing their hands or cleaning their instruments. Surgical tools might be used repeatedly on different people with only a quick wipe on a cloth, spreading infections instead of preventing them. Some common medical treatments of the time actively made hygiene worse. Poultices made from mixtures of herbs, animal fats, and other organic matter were applied to open wounds, creating an ideal environment for bacteria to multiply. Bloodletting, a popular treatment for many ailments, was done with tools that were rarely cleaned properly. Even practices meant to freshen the patient, such as applying scented oils or powders, often covered up signs of infection rather than addressing the cause. Because hygiene was not seen as a medical priority, the spread of disease within the royal court was almost inevitable. Illness could pass rapidly through crowded gatherings, shared living quarters, and the close contact between servants and their employers. In many cases, attempts to treat these illnesses only worsened the patient's condition. These same misconceptions even shaped the way they dressed, as clothing was designed and worn in ways that trapped dirt and bacteria rather than removing it. The garments that looked so fine in portraits were often far less clean than they appeared, and the layers themselves created a whole new set of hygiene challenges. The gowns worn by noble women were masterpieces of fabric and craftsmanship, but they were far from practical when it came to cleanliness. These dresses were made of heavy, layered materials, silk, brocade, velvet, that could not be washed frequently without damage. As a result, many garments went weeks or even months without proper cleaning. Beneath the layers, sweat, natural skin oils, and dust collected, along with traces of food or drink spilled during long court banquets. In crowded and unsanitary palace conditions, even particles from the environment could cling to the fabric, creating an invisible mix of residue. Undergarments were supposed to act as a barrier between the body and the outer clothing, but even these were not always washed as often as needed. Changing clothes might mean replacing only the top layers while the garments closest to the skin remained the same. Over time, this trapped moisture and heat created an ideal breeding ground for bacteria, especially in the folds and seams of the fabric. To cover any unpleasant smells, women relied heavily on perfume and scented powders. Fragrance became an essential part of court life, not only as a marker of wealth but also as a way to mask odors that cleaning could not remove. While the scent might have seemed pleasant from a distance, up close it often mixed with less appealing undertones. And the dirt didn't stop at the skin, it shaped the very air of the palace. The combination of rarely cleaned clothing, unwashed bodies, and poor sanitation created an atmosphere that was as much a part of court life as the gold and marble. The air inside Versailles was a mixture unlike anything most people today could imagine. Perfume drifted through the corridors, applied generously by courtiers to themselves and their clothing. But it mixed with far less pleasant scents, human waste from chamber pots and corridor accidents, the lingering odor of rotting food from overworked kitchens, and the musty smell of damp fabrics that were rarely cleaned. The palace's poor ventilation meant these odors often lingered, settling into the heavy drapes, upholstered furniture, and thick layers of clothing worn by those inside. Visitors from other parts of Europe often recorded their surprise, and sometimes their disgust, at the smell of the French royal court. In their accounts, they described the sharp contrast between the dazzling visual splendor of Versailles and the unpleasant reality of its air. Some noted how the sweetness of perfume could not completely hide the underlying mix of decay, sweat, and waste. Others mentioned feeling physically unwell after spending extended time in the palace rooms. For those who lived there, the smell became part of daily life, an accepted background to the rituals and routines of court. Servants and nobles alike moved through it without comment, focusing instead on maintaining appearances. Cleanliness, as understood at the time, was about what could be seen, not what could be smelled or sensed. But perhaps the most shocking thing is, many of these habits were choices, not necessities. The royal court had the means to improve its hygiene in some areas, yet long-standing traditions, beliefs, and social pressures often stood in the way. This leads to a deeper question. Why did they continue to live this way when change was possible? Life at court revolved around appearances, and hygiene habits were shaped as much by social expectations as by practical concerns. In the strict hierarchy of Versailles, every gesture, outfit, and accessory was a statement of rank. Fashion was not simply about beauty, it was a display of power, wealth, and influence. To deviate from the accepted styles or routines risked appearing uncultured or worse, disrespectful to the crown. This pressure meant that comfort and cleanliness were often sacrificed to maintain the image expected of a noblewoman. Medical theories of the time supported these choices. The belief that bathing could weaken the body or invite illness justified the avoidance of water, while the idea that strong scents could purify the air encouraged heavy use of perfume. Religious influence added another layer, discouraging practices viewed as indulgent or morally questionable. Together, these forces created an environment where poor hygiene was not only normal but also defended as the proper way to live. Even when the means to improve conditions existed, better sanitation, more frequent laundering, cleaner food storage, change was slow because tradition held such a strong grip. For many at court, doing things differently would have meant standing out for the wrong reasons. And those beliefs lasted much longer than you might think, carrying forward into later centuries and influencing the habits of other European courts long after Versailles had set the pattern. The hygiene habits of 17th-century Versailles did not vanish with the passing of one generation. Many of the same practices, rare bathing, perfume over cleanliness, elaborate but unwashed clothing, continued well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. As the French court set trends in fashion and etiquette, other European courts often followed its lead, adopting not only its styles but also its less appealing customs. Royal households in places like Spain, Austria, and parts of Italy mirrored these routines, reinforcing the idea that elegance was about display, not hygiene. Medical knowledge was slow to change, and without a clear understanding of germs or sanitation, there was little reason for the elite to abandon traditions that seemed to serve their social purposes. It was not until advances in medicine and public health in the late 19th century that these attitudes began to shift more noticeably. So next time you picture a queen in silk, remember that the beauty captured in portraits often hid an uncomfortable reality, one that lingered for centuries before modern hygiene finally took its place. The lives of royal women at Versailles were filled with grandeur, but also with discomforts that their fine clothing and glittering jewels could not hide. They avoided bathing for fear of illness, relied on chamber pots and poorly kept corridors instead of proper toilets, ate food prepared in kitchens vulnerable to contamination, endured wigs that harbored lice, and gave birth in crowded rooms under public scrutiny. These 5 worst hygiene habits reveal a world where beauty was carefully crafted on the surface while the realities underneath were far less refined. The contrast could not be sharper. Marble halls and golden mirrors surrounding women who lived with conditions we would now consider unacceptable. Their elegance was real, but it was paired with an unseen world of odors, pests, and risk. The lesson is a simple one. Appearances can be deceiving, and even the most perfect image may hide an imperfect truth. That is the legacy of beauty over comfort in the age of royal power.